We're here today with Dr. Jose Redondo, who I'll be referring to throughout this interview by his first name as Jose, but he's really a very distinguished psychologist who's done a great deal of work within the field that we're about to discuss. And I am Bryan Froehle, a PhD researcher who's here at service of the church to advance these critical conversations. So let me ask you, Jose, if you could begin to share just a little bit about your project on creating a questionnaire on sexuality of candidates for the priesthood. What was that about?
I've been involved in seminary formation for many years, 20 years or so. So I've interviewed a lot of seminarians, and I'm also a priest, or probably approaching at this time between counseling and evaluation, probably about 100 or so, or approaching 100. We're always trying to put together, trying to evaluate in the issue, regarding the issue of sexuality. We are pulling from different questionnaires, different things, and that are not necessarily designed to answer the questions that the church is interested in. So there was an opportunity when Father John Horn, who is a Jesuit priest who works out at the seminary here in Boynton Beach, the major seminary at St. Vincent de Paul. He wanted to put together a group of people, seminary professors, psychologists, priests, who would have a discussion regarding sexual maturity and of seminarians, candidates. And I was part of that discussion group, which, recently the book that was published,
Yes.
Spiritual Husbands, Spiritual Fathers, edited by Bishop Esteves and Bishop Cousins. So that's how this questionnaire actually came about, from the experience that I have had in working closely with seminarians and priests over the years, and then coming to fruition in a discussion with colleagues and fellow Catholics.
Thank you very much, Jose. Let's back up just a little bit here to maybe at the start of your career, when you began working with priests and interviewing priests or those who would be candidates for the Catholic priesthood. You've mentioned you've interviewed or worked with approximately 100. Is that right?
Yes, I think it's approaching 100, at least 90, approaching 100. Mm-hmm.
And so about when would you say you began interviewing priests or candidates for the Catholic priesthood? About what years would that have been?
Going back, slowly going back about 20 years, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we're talking more or less about, say, the year 1995 to the year 2000, somewhere around there?
Somewhere around there. Mm-hmm.
Great. And I'm wondering if we were to look back to when you first began doing this approximately 20 years ago, let's say in the late 1990s, if the issues you observed then were similar to the issues you observe today.
I think what has changed, in many ways, the issues are similar in terms of sexual maturity, in terms of issues regarding masturbation, prostitution, sexual identity. But the cultural context has changed very dramatically in terms of its permissiveness of not only homosexuality, but essentially unbridled sexuality, And, it used to be hard to reach pornography for any human being. Now it's hard to get rid of it. It's being pushed on our youth tremendously, causing tremendous harm, not just for priests and seminarians, but for our laity. So that has changed dramatically. The context in which the human beings continue to be human beings and have to struggle with the same issue, but influenced by different cultural influences and beliefs that are probably, I would say, complicated matters. for the church and for society in general.
So I presume you would say that a lot of the changes had to do with the emergence of this handheld device that we carry with us so very often.
The so-called computer, which is really a portable, a so-called phone, which is really a portable computer, yes.
And so would you trace back, for example, many of the issues that you see today to the emergence of this very ubiquitous handheld device? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I mean and particularly, you know, the content that they allow to put in these handheld devices. So the fact that you know, the Googles of the world and so on are not willing to allow people to opt into these things, but this is simply pushed on you. So that, you know, if a parent, if a Catholic parent buys a telephone to a 10-year-old, they have to figure out what are they going to have access to. And for example, I advise, when I'm seeing lay people, I advise them to not give them a phone unless they have some kind of control, like maybe Covenant Eyes or something like that, to filter a lot of the junk and the harm that is coming through that.
Well, thanks, Jose. Now let's go back and take a look at your own professional training. You began in the field where you practice now, Jose, about 20 years ago as well, or was that much earlier?
Earlier. Yes, I graduated in the 70s at Clark University in Massachusetts. That's where my PhD in psychology, in clinical psychology, was obtained, clinical and developmental psychology. Prior to that, I had actually been a seminarian myself, a Jesuit seminarian.
Where was that? Where were you a seminarian?
I'm a Cuban American, so the Antilles province sent me to the Dominican Republic at the time. Going back to the 60s now. So they sent me, I was 19-year-old, and they sent me to the Dominican Republic because the Antilles included Cuba, and so they made a special arrangement for Cuban Americans in Miami. Now I'm still, by the way, I conduct interviews for candidates that for the Jesuits. As a matter of fact, I'm just finishing up one now, and they're mostly sending them to Louisiana now because of the fact that, you know, we are Cuban Americans, we're not just Cubans. So there's really an American culture that we are very much into, and there's a compatibility there, I think, with Louisiana, a little bit more than very well, you know, good people and so on, but it's culturally different from us.
So in the novitiate then in Louisiana for the Central Province?
Yes, they are going now mainly going to there. I don't know of any candidate. Probably the last 3 candidates that I have interviewed for the Jesuits over the past few years have gone to Louisiana.
Very good, which means that now I can go ahead and ask you about any differences that you might observe between your work for those who are preparing for, say, Jesuit priesthood compared to, say, diocesan priesthood.
Well, you know, the spirituality is, you know, there's an emphasis, obviously, in Ignatian spirituality. They have done the spiritual exercises. But in terms of dealing with pornography, dealing with sexual issues, sexual maturity, it's the same, really. I don't think there's any difference. Now, the Jesuits, as you know, have an emphasis on spiritual direction. So oftentimes they have discussed this with their spiritual director. I remember I began spiritual direction because I went to Belen Jesuit High School here in Miami. And I was 12 when I began spiritual direction with a Jesuit priest, Father Oscar Sardinas. You know? That priest, 40 years later, was the spiritual director of my son. My son was at Belen. So, yes, there's spiritual direction, but the issues are very similar.
Exactly. And so this leads to the question then about the project with which you've been associated, the project of spiritual fathers and spiritual fatherhood. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how you understand that idea of spiritual fatherhood in the first place, before we then go on and take a look specifically about the questionnaire for which you've become very well known.
Well, thank you. The church for a long time, it's not just now. If you look at the church documents, Vatican documents, QSCP documents, for guidelines for the use of psychology in seminary admissions, came out in 2015. In 2005, the instruction from the Vatican regarding discernment of vocations with regard to people with homosexual tendencies and so on. The church hasn't really wanted to be content with simply chastity. Just the fact that a person is able to contain his sexual impulses, order his sexual impulses, and not fall into pornography or sexuality with a live human being. But the church has insisted that the priests be spiritual husbands and spiritual fathers, so that the idea of spousing the church and therefore loving the church, loving the church as a spouse, and therefore protecting the church as a spouse, and being careful about how they speak about the church as a spouse. I laugh because sometimes, since I deal very much with priests, sometimes they, even in other contexts, sometimes they let loose and express opinions that are not necessary. Are impulsive like any other human being. Priests don't stop being human beings. But the invitation is for that. The invitation is for a spouse of the church and a father. The book Saving 1,000 Souls, on vocation. We're all called to marriage. But some of us, our priests, are called to marry the church and to father the children of the church that are not going to be, a person like me who has a couple of kids, but rather really thousands of children. They become like a little bit like Abraham, fathering children and mentoring children and being protectors of children, and not using children as sexual objects, which has been an issue tremendously painful for the church and for society.
And so for you, this question of spiritual fatherhood is about us espousing the church. And I'm wondering if you could add any other dimensions to that within a man's affectivity, within that emotional and psychological makeup that, from your standpoint as a professional, is especially important to be thinking about.
In the questionnaire, we actually touch upon issues about what we feel. The father is a protector. So if I look at my own fatherhood, I'm very much inclined to protect children, to protect them, to point them to the truth, to point them to their destiny, who is the Lord. So the love of a father promotes life in the children, promotes a healthy life in the children. And therefore we protect, we provide, we're providers. We provide whatever they need in terms financially, or in the case of lay people. But certainly the spiritual food that the priest as a father offers us, obviously through the sacraments, but even acting as in persona Christi, representing Christ for us. These are signs of maturity that somebody for example, struggling with deep-seated homosexual tendency, is not clear about, and that's why, one of the criteria is to embrace people who have deep-seated, in the sense of loving them as the Lord loves all of us, but not necessarily including them as candidates for the priesthood.
Very well. Well, that brings us directly to the questionnaire on sexuality of candidates for the priesthood. And so the questionnaire itself, as you know very well as the designer of it, is more than a few pages long. In fact, it is 24 pages long. And there are a number of critical aspects to it. I'm looking at my copy right now as we speak. And I'd like to ask you, in terms of your design of the questionnaire, what do you see as the critical flow in the questionnaire? Any questionnaire like this, even when it is simply administered on a one-on-one basis, as you recommend, and the man completes it on his own in a separate and very particularly private space, it's essentially a kind of an interior dialogue. There's a kind of a flow that you're following. Yes. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe trace out a little bit about how you envision that interior dialogue to take place. What is the flow, in other words, for your questionnaire?
The questionnaire, if you look at it has 50 questions, no? and if you look at the first question and question number 50, you're going to see that for us, Christ is Alpha and Omega. So we begin with Christ and we end with Christ, which is a very different from questionnaires that often my colleagues in psychology use, right? So the first question that we ask is, Jesus Christ said, I am the truth. So how relevant is it for me to answer these questions? So there is an invitation already in the dialogue. We're trying to promote a dialogue between the candidate and the counselor as a mediator, but ultimately really with the vocation director. So a dialogue with the vocation director regarding sexuality, sexual maturity, and difficulties that they may have, with the intent of helping them. It's in many ways. But we begin as Catholics, we begin saying, and it's almost like a prayer, no? Like beginning with a prayer. The first question is, I am the truth. How relevant it is. Because we know also that people don't necessarily reveal what they think, and that people can lie on this. But in my experience, actually, I've administered the questionnaire maybe 5-6 times already. In my experience, the good ones will pay attention to question 1 and question 50. So the good candidates will pay attention to it, and it will be meaningful. And it will determine how they respond. That we're really interested in a dialogue about the truth, because I tell candidates, it's not a matter of hiding; it's a matter of being, and espousing the church. You're not going to be happy.
In a sense, Jose, the first question is really about truth, because you're citing a particular way. I am the truth specifically, and in your last question, question 50. It's much more about receiving in prayer Jesus's love for me and to help me develop my humanity and my vocation. So there's this sense of truth at the start and concluding with love. So allow me to ask, was that intentional as well in your design?
Yes.
Could you share a little bit more about that and how you might see that as related to the overall ambition of your questionnaire?
Yes. We need to begin with the truth, because it is only the truth will set us free from all these issues that I may have to discuss. And the only thing that is relevant to discuss is really the truth. It's the only way to help you, the only way to guide you, the candidate. But at the same time, we also know that we're made for that communion with Christ, and whatever issue we need to discuss with impulsive sexuality, with whatever it is that I'm dealing with, we're better off. And Christ is irreplaceable. We need to enter into that communion with Christ to help us cope with who we are and with our desires to be better, our desires to be free, our desire to be happy. No? So, yes, I was wondering as you spoke whether, if you remember, indignation exercises.
Oh, absolutely.
Contemplation to gain love. So I was wondering if that was a background influence there. But,
precisely,
yes.
Precisely. And so I was looking for how it is that you envision what you've constructed here, because the next space that one moves to in your questionnaire are really beliefs about sexuality. And then you ask your number of questions about the way worldviews, if you will, or ways of looking at thinking about questions of sex and sexuality. And only then do you go into the area of sexual and personal identity. And I wonder if you could share with us just a little bit about the choices that you've made here between moving, on the one hand, from worldviews about sex and sexuality and the kinds of topics and issues and questions you've chosen, and then to the questions of sexual and personal identity, and then the ways that you've constructed your questionnaire in that direction. And allow me to simply observe that it ultimately culminates in questions such as your question 18, I am ready to give up matrimony with a woman and having my own children for the sake of the kingdom of God, on to a question such as, I am confident I could be a good father to my own children. Now, many of these questions are simply very, very interesting. And since I have the privilege of interviewing the creative thinker behind this, I would simply like to understand a little bit more about what was going on inside your head, pointing out that you then, as the creator, move us only then to the question of psychosexual history. And it would be helpful for me just to hear a little bit about your movements, if you will, between these three areas, because those are the three areas, the three pivot points of your entire questionnaire. It's essentially worldviews, if you will, beliefs as you entitle them, around sex and sexuality. Then it's around sexual and personal identity. And then finally, it culminates in a whole series of questions regarding psychosexual history. And it would be helpful for me, certainly, to learn from you about what led to the construction in this way. What about these titles and topics? How did you choose what to place where? What seemed especially important to you, and so on?
Very good. Part of it is you're allowing the person that you're interviewing to feel increasingly comfortable in that dialogue. So it's easier for somebody to talk about beliefs, you know, than to talk about things I may have had to bring up in confession. So we start with the you know that even before the questions, because of the issue of people with inclinations to abuse children, we remove that right off the bat. I mean, those are exclusionary. We stop the interview if somebody's saying that I have a history of abusing children, or I don't have a problem with abusing children. And as a matter of fact, we tell them we may have to talk with authorities here, depending upon local laws and whatever. So we get that out of the way. But then we invite them to speak the truth. But we begin with an area which is beliefs, which are important, because what they believe is what they will later preach as priests. So it's not that the beliefs are not important, but they're easier to discuss than what I have personally done and where I have personally failed. So we begin with masturbation, and what do you think of masturbation? Is it something healthy? Pornography, which is something that invariably they will have been exposed to, pretty much, unless it's, I've often also evaluated priests for incarnation, and if they come from a third world country, sometimes the phones, the computers, portable computers are not as pervasive, so they may not have been so exposed. But we begin to talk about beliefs because they are important, but also because it's easier. So just to guide them into a dialogue. Right? I remember that we ask usually for a rating, but also always for an explanation, because in the explanation we're trying to promote a dialogue and trying to understand the meaning of the response. It's not simply a quantitative number that we say, okay, I disagree. Okay, please explain why you disagree or why you agree. So again, promoting a dialogue, but being mindful that it is easier to talk about these beliefs as opposed to what I have done. So we also, in the beliefs, we try to use contemporary language so that the person, the candidate, is hearing the question in terms of how this is being discussed in the wider culture from where he emerges. So,
excuse me, Jose, can you give me an example of that?
Yes. For example, homosexuality is a normal variant of gender identity, not a sexual disorder. For example. So that would be an example. When the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual began many years ago, the first one, it considered homosexuality a sexual disorder. No longer. We're now in the DSM-5. No longer, particularly from the DSM-3 on. So that would be an example. We use the word gay, for example, intentionally, again, because it's what they will use. So this is the church should support gay culture, and we ask them that question. We use, for example, well, this is in sexual identity, but we use the term gender fluid, which is something that they're gonna hear. So we try to meet them where they are and promote a dialogue. Then we go into sexual identity and personal identity. How do I identify myself? Am I heterosexual? Am I homosexual? Am I gay? Am I bisexual? Am I gender fluid? Am I other? Because you see all kinds of combinations of people saying I am this, but this, and it's a tremendous number of terms that are being used to define who I am as a gender fluid or whatever it is that they refer to themselves as. So we're trying to use vocabulary that is understandable by contemporary young men, and that they can speak to. And then, we go into opposite sex attraction, same sex attraction, then a discussion about sexual maturity, what they're gonna see in terms of sexual maturity, and whether or not they tend to be close friendships with women as opposed to men, or only men. So we begin to look at issues that may reveal issues with sexual maturity that way for dialogue and to help them.
So excuse me, Jose, what would it suggest then if someone were to say it's easier for me to relate to women than to men, which is your question 16? I'm just curious.
Right. There's no reason why a mature man cannot relate to men and women and have friends. It's a concern that you can only have friends with one gender, and that which is not your own. Typically, men have friendships, friendship with men, You know, so young boys will befriend their friends, will be boys, and girls will have friends as girls first. Then they start branching out. But the inability to have close friendships with men is a concerning sign, and particularly if there is a tendency to sexualize whatever friendship you can develop with a man. So that's a red flag that we want to I'm part of the counseling. Huh?
I said, so you're looking for red flags here. This is very helpful for us to be talking about. So could you maybe share, as you look over some of these pages, some of these questions, other red flags, things that would function for you as a red flag?
Well, the question that you mentioned, question 18, am I ready to give up matrimony, no? And having my own children for the sake of the kingdom. We need to know if they are, but also why they are. So if they say, yeah, because I can't do it, that's not what we want to see. We want to see somebody who's capable, but who wants to espouse the church instead. So that would be a red flag. Somebody said, no, I agree completely, because I can't do it. You know, I don't see myself as a father. I don't see. Well, then how can you be the father to your congregation?
So in other words, if I'm hearing you correctly, Jose, you see a number of these questions in terms of the spiritual fatherhood focus that you're describing earlier, that you began with Father John Horn, the Jesuit that you mentioned before, was looking towards readiness for fatherhood to then transfer that to readiness for spiritual fatherhood. Am I hearing that correctly?
Totally correct. Yes. And that is exactly right. So we believe that someone who is unable to be a father to biological children will struggle being a good spiritual father.
So let me ask you question 20, and we're now about the midway through the questionnaire. There are about 50 questions in all, as you said. Is to give up being a father of my own children in order to become a priest is a challenge for me. Would it be a red flag if someone were to completely agree, or would it be a red flag if someone would completely disagree? Where is the red flag in that?
I think the red flag is in the explanation rather than in the response.
Well, that's fantastic, Jose, because what you're leading to now is so very helpful is in this section, moving forward to psychosexual history, you're leading us toward your experience, really, over 20 years, plus your own lived experience within a seminary of the Society of Jesus, to give a sense of your dynamics of self-understanding and of the interview process with so many whom you've interviewed over the years. Isn't that right?
That is right. It's I think, you know, psychologists know that relationship with the father, relationship with the mother is key in terms of a healthy personality formation. Now we're seeing in society something else we're seeing is some divorce is so prevalent. So the difficulties in relating to a father, because sometimes it's a stepfather, and sometimes even the stepfather, the mother and the stepfather divorce again. So there's a fragmentation there that makes the emergence of healthy relationships harder. But the Lord is merciful and always provides us with mentors, with ways of compensating for that. And we want to identify, you know, how was your relationship with the father? Here's a man, a young man, who's saying, I'm interested in becoming a priest. Okay. We're interested in seeing if there's a potential here to maybe mobilize some resources, you know, that maybe even the candidate can even sometimes, you know, they may have health insurance and they can use their own health insurance, go to counseling. As long as they go to a counselor that, again, like this questionnaire aims to be, in communion with the church, in communion with the anthropology of the church, with what the church proposes. And that's what's very unique, I find, about this questionnaire. From cover to cover, it aims to be in communion with the church, because the church is the truth. So it's the church sets us free with the truth that it proposes to us.
Jose, that's so very helpful because you've really developed this out of your long experience and your own insights. And of course, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the design of the questionnaire, even as it moves into the psychosexual history aspect, and even then as it moves into the conclusion that you've described already for us, which is that famous question 50 about open to receiving Jesus's love for me, help me develop my humanity and my vocation, which reads so clearly that it reflects that aspect of the spiritual exercises, doesn't it? And so certainly want to lift up all those sources that have been so critical for you. What I've heard so far would be a source from your own Jesuit formation years ago. I've heard a source that would have to do with all of those interviews you've been doing with those preparing for the priesthood over the last 20 years, from the late 1990s moving forward. And I've been hearing as well a real focus from your own preparation, not only as a psychologist, but also as someone who is deeply in love with the church and church documents and teachings. But I'd like to get a little bit more specifics now that drills down and goes maybe even to greater detail. Could you share with us other collaborators or conversation partners who have suggested questions, reviewed questions, or with whom you've been in partnership as you've developed this tool?
When Pope Francis was asked about his faith, he didn't speak about his theology professors at the seminary. He spoke about his grandma. And I want to speak about my mom. She taught me to love the church. My mom is, for most of her life, went to Mass every day, really. And she's now 98, and with all the COVID and so on, not so much. But she's been a great influence. Later, and even as a role of a father, it was actually Bishop Esteres that asked my wife and I to host girls that were coming from Milan, Italy, to spend a year at St. Bernard High School here in Miami. And we hosted over the year 13 girls. So even though I have 2 biological children, and we hosted 13 Italian girls, and we go to their weddings and so on. They're very beautiful Catholic women with faith formation, belonging to the movement Communal Liberation. So that has been another important influence in my life.
Are you yourself involved in Comunione Liberazione? Are you involved in that yourself?
I am. Yes, I'm part of the Diaconia for Florida. I used to be responsible for Florida. So yes, very involved in the fraternity. I'm a member of the fraternity.
So you're a member of the fraternity itself?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And so that clearly is...
The Father Giussani's, one of the things that attracted me to Father Giussani was his fidelity to the church, his fidelity to the Pope, which is very much in line also with Ignatian spirituality, fidelity to the Pope. Sometimes my Jesuit friends forget, but the Holy Spirit sent us Francis to remind him that we have to follow the Vicar of Christ. So we follow the Pope as the Vicar of Christ. So, yes.
Now, how long, Jose, have you been part of Comunione Liberazione? How long have you been part of that?
I would say about 12, 13 years.
Oh, okay. So only 12 or 13 years, which is probably when you just really began to focus on interviewing priests as well in very large numbers.
Yes, I had studied in Massachusetts, so, and I had been away from Miami many years. So I lived in Massachusetts 10 years, So when I came to Miami, I really had very few links to the church. You know, I go to the parish, but.
And what parish is that, may I ask?
Sure. St. Hugh Parish, but now, yes, we now belong to, we moved, and now we belong to Epiphany Parish in Miami. Epiphany, with Father Jose Alvarez, Epiphany Parish. The Church
Very well.
South Miami, yes.
Church of the
Epiphany.
Oh, you're in Epiphany Parish. Very good.
Yeah.
And so that's really where you identify right now within Epiphany Parish. And within Epiphany Parish, as a member of Comunio e Liberazione, meaning that you also have these influences
Absolutely.
in terms of your research.
And by the way, Father Jose Alvarez used to be vice rector of the seminary when I was seeing seminarians all along. And so, yes, there's a friendship there and an influence there. And yes, I am blessed with many good friends and people that I can talk to. Now, the questionnaire was directly enriched by the group that came to reflect for the Spiritual Husbands and Spiritual Fathers book. So that, for example, I must give credit to Father John Horn for question 50. I tinkered with it, but he and I, by the way, fought, you know, for keeping question 1, because it just doesn't look very psychological to begin that way. But he said, you know, this is who we are, and but he suggested, okay, I reworded it a little bit, but he proposed it. So, and all the authors, I don't want to make them responsible for anything wrong with the questionnaire or anything like that. But I love being part of that discussion group, and it definitely helped me integrate, summarize my thoughts, my experiences in a way that allowed me to come up with this questionnaire. Another person I should mention, part of that group, is Dan Almeida, who's a counselor who specializes in helping people overcome homosexual tendencies. And Dan is a good friend and a great man, and his thinking also helped me. Even when I am helping somebody overcome this tendency, I will often refer them to Dan's article.
And who is that, may I ask?
Dan Almeida. He's a counselor in Georgia. Yeah, and he's one of the people publishing in the book. Yeah, the spiritual. So his article is in there.
And so he's been a major interlocutor in this as well, and you've worked with him in this.
Yes, I would say probably the main one has been Father John Horn, and but then definitely Dan, and he's someone that I know we can call each other and you know, help us out anytime. Father Earl Fernandez, also a very interesting fellow who has published on homosexuality, and he helps the nuncio in Washington, Nuncio Pierre. He was also part of the discussion group, and I don't want to make them responsible for any limitations with the questionnaire, but yeah, they definitely were part of the discussion that enriched my thinking in being able to put this.
So is it safe to say that then you're the sole author of this questionnaire, but you've had many partners over the years, not just those 3 general sources that I mentioned, but also simply your relationship with Father Jose Alvarez, or with Bishop Esteves, or of course with Father John Horn, and with Dan Almeida and Earl Fernandez and Father Earl Fernandez and his work as well. Is that right?
Yes. Many years ago when I came, like I started to say, I wasn't connected to
interrupt, but you came in what year?
This is even prior to that, so 1980s. Okay.
Oh, okay. So you were back in Miami by the 1980s.
Yes, and yes, And so I felt, comfortable as a psychologist. But I realized that the church needed psychologists, and I didn't know exactly where to begin. So I prayed, Lord, help me help your church. And that prayer was answered gradually. First, there was Father Fernando Heria, who is at the Shrine of Our Lady of Charity. He was a vicar at St. Hugh, where I was at the time. And he really immersed me in the archdiocese by evaluating cases of annulment. So he's one of the judges, he's a lawyer. So that's how I started with annulment. When Bishop Esteves became bishop, auxiliary bishop of Miami, he put me right in the middle of the archdiocese. And from then on, it really, the whole collaboration with the church really took off. We had been friends before, because I have a daughter with learning disabilities, and he started the first program with learning disabilities here at St. Agatha Church in Miami. So we became friends that way. And so he really immersed me. And then from then on, every archbishop has included me. Now I am an adjunct professor of psychology at St. John Vianney Seminary here in Miami.
So
but I do not. Huh?
You teach at the college seminary?
I was offered to teach, but I don't want to be counseling somebody that I feel I need to give an F to. So instead, what I do is I lecture, particularly on psychosexual development, at least once a year. But I don't have to grade anybody because I'm seeing a number of the students in growth counseling.
Understood. So you probably knew Bishop Esteves then in the early 90s when your daughters were coming up.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And since that time, then you've deepened these connections because that has led you then to develop this ever closer tie of church service. So as we're looking at concluding the interview, of course, I want to make sure that over the next bits of time ahead in this conversation, you've got the opportunity to add anything you would care to about the questionnaire, the design, and the vision. But I'd like to make sure that I would first of all ask you just a little bit more about your sense of vocation yourself at this point. You've clearly grown in a sense of vocation to serve the church. And I'm wondering if you could share with us just a little bit about your own personal sense of vocation and service.
Yes. Actually, I first met Father Horn at the Institute for Priestly Formation in Omaha, Nebraska, where I had been connected to him by Bishop Esteves, who wanted us to know each other. So I went and spent it was an 8-day retreat that Father Horn was leading, and I was assisting the seminarians there. I remember because I see this as a vocation for me. This is what the Lord wants me to do. So I remember in the church there, at Creighton University, feed my sheep. There were 150 seminarians at the time. I was talking to 4 of them. I was assigned to 4 of them. But feed my sheep, and I said, but I'm not a priest. What do you mean feed my sheep? Feed my sheep? But I have increasingly dedicated my life to the church, so that the priority is that. Even my home. My wife said, my wife had prayed, let us put this home at the service of the church. And we've had many a meeting here in my house. regarding the church. And of course, we've hosted 13 Italian girls, like I said, plus 2 more for the summer. So that's 15 girls that have stayed with us, and that are like spiritual daughters that we have. So yes, it definitely, this is definitely for me in response to what I understand that the Lord wants me to do, to help His church. Now that also includes laity, and by the way, a few Protestants. So for some reason, I have been called to ecumenism, so that they know I'm Catholic, but I've seen some pastors in counseling, and they refer me, some Baptists and Adventists and Anglicans. So I also see Christians, not just Catholics, but predominantly, especially now, predominantly Catholic. It's rare that I see someone now that doesn't come through the church and somehow referred by a priest. Or it's all the 99% is through the church or old patients that come to see me.
Which means that now your practice has evolved from the 1980s to the present time, when you are primarily focused on church service in the work you do within psychology.
Absolutely.
And so that brings me to the question now of what you might wish to add to your understanding of the vocation called to priesthood, and how that call to priesthood is reflected in the questionnaire on sexuality of candidates for the priesthood, your QSCP.
Very good. From the very beginning, we are dealing with someone that we assume has been called by Christ, and therefore we want to be able to, for the priesthood, therefore we want to be able to treat that individual with a great deal of respect and appreciation, regardless of what they tell us. I have had the privilege really of entering into a dialogue with exceptional human beings of many cultures. I've been enriched by their faith, by their experiences, by their love for the church. That I've been people from all over the world. Vietnamese, Haitians, Cubans. I sometimes have to do the interview. If I have something I can do in Portuguese, I'll give it to them, or Haitian Creole. It's really the international, the universal Catholic Church that I deal with, and it's been a blessing to me, extremely enriching to me. I've grown to love these people, the candidate. You very rarely run into. I mean, I can't even think of someone that I've seen cases where I've had to recommend. Not at this time, I don't think that this can be done. The decision is obviously the vocation director, but we give a recommendation. But typically, the Lord is moving beautiful hearts, and we intend to help them.
Now, this brings me to what will be among my final questions, simply in recognition of time, by no means suggesting that we've come to anywhere near the conclusion we could come to on this very important question. What I would like to ask you, and I'd like to ask if you were to look straight in the screen as if you were speaking to a bishop or a vocation director, what would you most commend about the questionnaire you've designed, whether or not a bishop or a vocation director would use the questionnaire exactly as is, or use portions or the spirit behind it? What would you most earnestly want to say at this time about your work on this questionnaire of some 50 questions?
I would tell them, don't be afraid of the truth. I would tell them, let us find out what is really going on in this person's mind and heart. So sometimes I think there's a little fear that we need a lot of vocations, and therefore let's not necessarily ask too much. Don't be afraid of the truth. The truth will set us free, and the Lord will accompany us. What is critical, I think, is to identify the talents and the limitations early on, and then channel resources that will help this person develop in communion with the Lord, and with all the richness of the church, and not only counseling, but obviously also prayer and sacramental life. Don't be afraid of the truth. Just address the issue. I see sometimes that there's not enough focus on, okay, what is really going on here, and how can we help? It's important because there's if the Lord will help us, the Lord will help us. Don't be afraid of the truth.
Don't be afraid of the truth seems to be such a perfect space at which we should conclude this interview. Nonetheless, if you would have anything else to add, I would like to welcome it right now. But it may be that you simply conclude, Jose, that don't be afraid of the truth is the point of conclusion. What other words might you wish to say at this time?
Then don't be afraid of the truth. The truth will set us free, and the Lord is with us. So trust the Lord. Trust the Lord.
And to that, I'm sure, Dr. Jose Redondo, what we should all say is amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much.